Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've got a guest tonight. His name is Jeff Harding. He and I met a couple of years ago. He told me a little bit about his encounter up in Canada, and I'm telling you, it is fascinating. There is an incredible amount of detail. Now, he started and created and hosts a YouTube channel called Pine Island Research. So I will put that link in the description to this video for you to access his other videos. But when you talk about people who are paying attention to details and categorizing them and putting them back, and those are the things that I'm looking for. I'm looking for the details because sometimes that separates the reality from the fluff. But there's a component to his story that stood out to me like a glaring light bulb, and it involves the way. Well, I'll leave that up to you. I'm going to bring it up at the end of him laying this out, the part that I gravitated to because I have an experience that relates to a component of his story. So that's why we're here today. And Jeff, buddy, the floor is yours. Give as much detail as you possibly can from the very beginning. I'm fascinated with it. I can't wait to hear it again.
Sure. Well, I grew up the son of a hunting and fishing guide, and I went to high school and went to school in eastern South Dakota, fairly flat land there. A lot of upland bird hunting, big game hunting as far as, white-tailed deer, mule deer, antelope, things like that. We had a place up in northern Minnesota, up in the woods, in Lakes Country, and we would go there and spend a lot of time in the summer there. But my dad guided throughout different remote areas of uh, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Winnipeg, and or not Winnipeg, but Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And so I grew up kind of with that as a second nature. I mean, I learned very quickly that paying attention to detail is a life and death deal. And I loved being in those situations, in those environments where, one, I always had people that I was learning from between my dad and some of his clients and other guides he networked with. But it just instilled this love for adventure and the outdoors. So I knew right away after high school, I wanted to go into the military. And so I had signed up to join the U.S. Army, and I graduated in 1987 in May, towards the end of May. And as we were graduating, a friend of mine was telling me that him and his dad and his brother and about a half a dozen of his uncles and cousins. I mean, it was an extended family thing for him. We're going to be going way up into northern Manitoba on a, 8 or 10 day fishing excursion. Wanted to know if I wanted to go with. I didn't leave for the Army until July 23rd. So I had some time to waste here. And they were going to be going that first week in June. And so I went and told my parents, I said, I think I'm going to go with them. And they were like, yeah, go ahead. Now, when just to let you know, my friend, his dad was also a very avid outdoorsman, big game hunter. And where he had decided to put this trip together was based on he had gone moose hunting up there with these three Inuit guides that had lived their whole lives in this forest, and they all three were brothers. And they had invited him up. If you ever want to come up fishing, they don't fish, they aren't fishing guides. But they said if you want to come up with your family members at some point, if you can get up here, we'll take you out. We'll host you and whatnot. They had a very primitive camp. And so this was going to be exciting. We really didn't know what to expect when we got there. How primitive is this going to be,
Right.
And we had drove up with a long livestock trailer, which if you're familiar with those, they're different than a regular enclosed trailer. Very strong suspensions in these because of the weight they normally carry. And we needed that for the terrain that we were going to be in. You couldn't just pull an enclosed trailer down these tank trail type roads, you'd just blow the suspension out of them. But we took one of these trailers and brought four 16-foot long aluminum guide series Lund boats with that were just no trailers, just threw these boats in here and stacked them up in each other. And we brought four 25 horse outboards with us with, you know, tanks and all that. So it was just your typical V-hull aluminum boat that had bench seats in it. It wasn't fancy. And we were pulling these up there because they didn't have enough boats for 10 people. We were bringing our own stuff. We pulled that with a 1-ton Ford truck, an F-350, and then we also were bringing a Suburban that had like a 4-inch lift on it and pretty all-terrain tires. And there was 10 of us total. And me and my best friend, his brother was younger than us. He had just turned 14. So I think he was going to be a freshman in high school, whereas we had just graduated. But we were by far the youngest in this group. All of his uncles and cousins and everybody, his cousins were all in their 20s. So, we just kind of felt like there was some camaraderie in the fact that we were the youngest here. But as 18-year-olds, especially the son of a hunting guide, I felt like I had some stuff to prove, I guess. But we drove 30 some hours out of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And if you're sharing the screen that I've got up, it's about where my cursor is here. It's right here. And we went all the way up past South Dakota, all the way up through North Dakota to the Canadian border. Then when you get into Winnipeg or get into Manitoba, you've got to go all the way up through a lot of lake country and wilderness. You see the southern, maybe 20% of it is pretty flat farmland, but it doesn't take long before you start getting into really, really remote, dense areas. And we went all the way up to the last big, I shouldn't say big city, but established city we were in was right here on the Saskatchewan Manitoba border. It's Flin Flon, old logging community. From Flin Flon up to Granville Lake was going to be about another 150 miles. And it was rough terrain. I mean, when you're in the lower 48 here, when you think of remote fire trails, it wasn't even that. I mean, pulling this trailer and getting these vehicles down these roads, that last 100 miles in took us like 6 to 8 hours just to get into this place. But we ended up on Granville Lake, which is part of what you would call the Churchill River system. You can kind of see how these lakes all kind of flow right into each other. I mean, it's just crazy how if you had a canoe, you could probably travel 800 miles just from water to water with just minimal portages. But when you're on these bodies of water and you look around at shorelines, you don't see power lines, you don't see cabins, you don't see anything. It all is very disorienting because every shoreline is just forest, you know. And so we ended up here. Uh, we came in and was in right in this area. I don't remember if it was this side or this side of this small point here, but we had gotten in on these fire trails to where these guys had a primitive cabin. And these guys guided moose hunters up here in the falls. Moose hunters, and I don't know if they did bear hunting too or not, but these three brothers, and they had a small primitive cabin for themselves. We had brought tents, and it was the 7th to 10th of June, that first weekend in June. And so down here in the lower 48, that first week in June's pretty nice. Up there, you'd wake up with an inch of snow on the ground, and then by the afternoon, it'd be 65, 70 degrees. It was really big fluctuations in temperature. Um, but the thing is me and my friend and his brother were going to be together each day in a boat. We were experienced enough that they trusted us to be in this boat. And this was before smartphones. We had a primitive map of the lake that was laminated. Some of these bigger islands are named, some of the smaller ones aren't. You can see Thorntonson Island, uh, Monocoma Island, but these little small islands really don't have names. And the thing is without GPS and before all that, you go out in a little boat and you get on the backside of one of these islands, you could get lost and disoriented very quickly. If you look at the amount of islands on this lake, you'd think, how could you lose your campsite? You could be in big trouble if you got on the backside of a couple islands away and didn't understand where you needed to go. Um, and so each day, the first day, we didn't go very far from camp. We'd take off at 7, 8 in the morning after breakfast, the three of us in a little boat. And Paul would drive. Me and Paul both had a lot of experience running outboard motors. His little brother really didn't. But we would go out and the first day we didn't go very far from camp because we didn't want to get lost. But you really didn't have to catch fish. I mean, the northern pike, the walleye fishing, it was just crazy how you could catch a fish almost every cast, just about anywhere you went, it seemed like. But we would go out that first morning and we caught quite a few fish. And around 2 or so in the afternoon, everybody would meet back at the dock. They had two docks in here at this primitive camp. Everybody agreed to come back around 2 o'clock. We'd share how we did and where we went and, have lunch. And then later on in the day, we'd go back out. So when we came in, we were beaming. We had a stringer of fish and we thought we had, nobody did as good as us, right? We came into that dock and jumped. We got out of that boat like we were 10 foot tall and bulletproof, just peacocking around and showing off our fish, and everybody's laughing. They all pull out their stringers. Everybody caught fish just like us. So we didn't really accomplish anything.
Oh, the exuberance of youth.
Yeah. It was a little humbling, at first, but, it just set the bar a little higher for us. We're going to show them yet. So that was kind of the MO is in the morning, we get up and have breakfast, uh, go out and fish in the morning for, 5, 6 hours, and then come back shortly after the midday period and have lunch. And then we'd usually hang out around camp for a couple hours and go out and fish those twilight evening couple hours. So that couple hours before dark was really good fishing. And each day we went a little bit further away. We started getting a little braver, started getting a little more orientation of what the things looked like around there. Um, and one of the things I found really interesting is when you look at this, how many islands and whatnot there are out there, is how many times we saw big game swimming in the lake, whether it be white-tailed deer, whether it be bear, black bear. Um, a lot of times it'd be moose. We'd see moose swimming. We'd see caribou swimming. Um, and it just kind of puzzled me. Like, what makes something stand on a shoreline and look at another shoreline way out there and say, I need to swim there, you know? And it just, the in retrospect, now that I've done a lot of research and really looked at, have a more extensive wildlife background, I do believe that some of that involves apex predator pursuit, meaning a white-tailed deer is being chased by a pack of, 6, 8 wolves. It ends up at a water's edge and it doesn't have a choice. It's swimming. I think a lot of times an animal may have to take that route because it has reached a shoreline and it has no option. Other times I think it's just the curiosity. The grass looks greener over there. I don't know. But the fact that it didn't seem to matter, deer, bear, moose, caribou, I mean, all these animals that don't seem to be built for such a feat have no problem swimming a couple miles from a mainland to wherever. Um, so we would pull up next to moose sometimes swimming in the, I mean, you'd be 10 feet from them in your boat, just trolling right next to them. It was just crazy to see these animals like that close. Well, we kept going a little bit further out and we ended up one day, there's this island here, Patton Island. You can see it's got some odd shapes to it, but we ended up on the back side of this island. So from there, we could not see where our campsite was, but we knew that if we followed the edge of that island around, that when we got to the shoreline, we would find the campsite as long as we got to that shoreline. So we had no problem going to the other side of the island. When we were over there, my friend's little brother had to take a pee. And he's one of these dudes that can't pee out of a boat. We got to go to shore. And almost all of these islands, it's kind of crazy because you can notice this when we zoom in. All of these shorelines have like a pea rock, gravelly shoreline. Almost like a beach, but it's not really all sand. It's like I say, it's like pea rock or river rock. Um, And we were out in this area at the time, and we thought, well, let's just go to this little island right here. It's northwest of Patton Island. And we pulled up here on this shoreline right here. It gets blurry when I zoom in here. This island's about 25, 30 acres. It is undulated. So the middle of the island probably sits about 30 feet above the water. And it is covered in pines and poplar and cedar and birch. Um, Pretty dense. When we were pulled up on the shoreline, we pulled the boat up onto the shoreline. My friend and his brother were taking a leak, and I really didn't have to go. So I was walking down the beach this direction. And when I got about probably 40, 50 yards away from them, looking at the tree line, there was a really wide game trail. And I don't mean, if you're familiar with game trails, big game trails made by deer, even if you were to find one that has bear traffic on it, they don't get much wider than 2 feet wide. I mean, this thing was like 4 foot wide. And when you looked up it went up an incline that was almost like 20 degrees, it went uphill into these trees. And these trees had overhang to them. So when you look up it, you could see maybe 25, 30 feet, and you'd have to walk up at 25, 30 feet to see another 25 or 30 feet. It's just kind of the height of how this overhang was. So I started walking up this thing and I'm looking down, trying to see tracks. And it was tricky trying to go up it because that morning, like I say, we had about an inch of slush and snow on the ground. But this was about 10:30, 11 in the morning now. It had been misting a little bit. Everything was wet, but it had stopped raining for about an hour. And it never was raining that much where you would quit fishing. I mean, if you had a rain jacket, it just a misty type uh day. But there was zero wind. Just zero wind. I could hear you snap your finger from 100 yards away in that wet air. And as I'm trying to walk up this trail, the floor of it, it's like greasy clay that had pine needles over it, a thatch of pine needles over it. But you'd take one or two steps and you'd slide back a step, and then you'd walk two or three steps and slide back. It was hard footing because I was wearing Converse, the old Converse high top tennis shoes. We thought we were in a boat all day. I wasn't planning on hiking anywhere, needing hunting boots or anything. Um, and I just kept moving up this trail, and I got far enough up it when I turned back, I couldn't see down to the beach anymore. But I heard it was like thunder cracking. And it may have just been because of the wet air, it sounded that loud, but it was like a log snapped. Um, it was to my left of where the trail that I'm on, it was to the left of it, but it only seemed like it was 40 or 50 yards away. And at that time, I did a lot of bow hunting. And anybody who's an archer or does a lot of bow hunting, you start guesstimating and understanding what yardage looks like. When I say 50 yards, I'm within 2 yards of exactly 50 yards. If I say 45 yards, you really get a good idea when you look at something how far away it is when you grow up in those hunting environments. And I really estimated this sound was 40, 45 yards to my left. And I was a little worried because I thought it was going to be a black bear. We had seen plenty of black bear on even on these little islands on the shorelines. And in the first week of June, what you're going to be most worried about is if you have a sow with a couple cubs. You might find yourself in a precarious situation there. So I was really reluctant to turn around and take off down the hill towards the beach and trigger like some pursuit mode or something. I thought just stand still, look into the forest to my left there at where I heard this, and wait until I see movement so I can verify how far away this whatever the source of this sound was is from me. And to give you an idea what I'm looking at, the deadfall that's in there. There's a lot of cedar deadfall in there, and there's a lot, or I should say, cedar scrubs that sit like 6 to 8 foot tall. Can't really see through them well. And there was a lot of birch trees in there. And birch trees, when you have an island that's undulated like that, you don't have like 3, 4 foot of black dirt something grows in. You've got 6 to 8, 10 inches of dirt, and then there's rock. And birch trees really don't have deep root systems, anyways. A lot of times you'll see a black bear in northern Minnesota scratching its back, on a birch tree and just knock it over. They just aren't that strongly planted. Um, their root balls aren't that big. So I'm looking at a lot of down birch trees. I'm looking at a lot of deadfall. Nothing had cleared timber out of there. So it's hard to see way into this forest floor. But if you would have seen black bear movement, it would have stood out. I mean, it wasn't that bad. So I stood there and stared, waiting, and I didn't see anything after about a minute. I could hear my friend and his brother yelling up this trail to me, saying, "Hey, Jeff, what was that? What was that?" They had heard it too. It was that loud down there. Um, And so I just stood there waiting. I didn't yell back at them because, again, I don't know where this thing is. I'm not going to stand there and start making a bunch of noise. Um, and it was just puzzling to me that I was not seeing this movement. This was not that far away from me. And like I say, if a bird chirped 150 yards away, I was hearing it. I mean, it was that moist air, that sound was just so reverberated in there, you know? And so I looked back down to the beach because I thought, are they going to come up this trail after me? I thought my friends would be coming up it and they weren't. And when I turned around to look up the trail, I'm looking at two thighs that are like the size of 5-gallon buckets right at my eye level. Now, because of that incline, what was standing here 15 feet away from me in front of me was probably standing on ground that was about 3 foot higher than the ground that I was standing on, just to give you an idea of the steepness of that incline. So even though this thing's seemed to be extremely tall, it was standing on higher ground than me. But I'm looking right at its thighs, and these thighs, I ain't kidding you. I mean, they were as big as my chest. It was like two 5-gallon bucket diameter thighs next to each other, covered in really dark hair. I wouldn't call it black. I'd call it maybe dark, like when you look at dark chocolate, it's it's like so brown it looks black kind of. Um, and right away, just kind of froze there for a moment because I've been bear hunting. I've been in front of black bears before. I've seen every animal that should be in that area. I've seen before in person, fairly close up, and I was just right away kind of taken aback. And as I slowly started looking up this body, I realized at its waist, I can see basically, let me get to it. Basically, from about here to the tip of these fingers, that you could see skin around the cuticles, but they had hair on them, and they were cradling a birch log that was about 6 foot long with a root ball on one end. And when I say a root ball, the root system you could fit in a 5-gallon bucket. The 6 foot long, this thing was probably around 5 to 6 inches in diameter, that log was. But these fingers are just holding it, cradling it at waist level, at this thing's waist level, just casually holding it there. Not in a threatening manner, not extending it out at me. But I'm looking at these fingers and I'm like, these things, they have hair on them, but this isn't a bear. There's no claws on this. Looks like a human hand. And as I look up, I see at where the hips are into the chest, there was no hourglass to it. I mean, the body mass at the width of the hips maintained that through up into the chest and the arm width. It was just really overwhelming how much body mass was on this. And I'm leaning way back now because, like I say, this thing's standing 3 foot above me in incline. It's only about 15 feet in front of me. And as I lean way back and I can see into its neck and I see its chin, I see the skin on its face looks the best way I could describe it is dried dirt. If you've ever seen like a black dirt that's been in the sun, it has that grayish hue to it. There is no shine. It doesn't look like there's any shine at all. It is flat, and I mean the like a matte flat sheen to the skin, and it's dark. And there's hair on its face, but I mean, I'm talking about the nose and around the top of the mouth, up through the bridge of the nose. The nose wasn't straight down like a human's, like mine or your nose is, but as you would envision, like an ape, you know, how flat and wide open the nostrils are, wasn't like that either. It was like sometimes you'll see a human that has a nose where their nose is just kind of looks like it's turned up a bit, kind of had that shape to it. It was wider, but now also in retrospect, when I looked at these features and I'm describing them as massive, like the nose was big, the mouth was really wide, I also have to take into consideration this thing's head was over twice as big as my head. So when I say, oh, it had a big nose, compared to what? You know, compared to a human? Yeah, it had a huge nose compared to a human,
Well,
but
that's
it
one
didn't.
that's one thing that I've always mentioned to people, that they have an over exaggeration of the size of the feet of these things, but it's not large for the size of the creature.
Exactly.
It's actually proportionate. It's just large compared to our feet.
And, you know, understanding I didn't grow up in a family that had the uncle sitting around the campfire talking about how he saw Bigfoot or this and that. I'd never had any experience of this. As much as I'd been in the outdoors and seen about big game animal you can find in the lower 48 and in the southern half of Canada, I'd never been in front of somebody telling me about what their Bigfoot experience was like. I'd never heard of anybody who'd had one. So my reference to this, I think I may have saw the PG film on a Saturday matinee at the movie theater when I went to see a movie. Before the movie played, I think they played a clip of the PG film. I remember seeing that there, right?
Mhm.
And I'm thinking, wow, is that real or not? You know, that's pretty impressive. But that was my only reference to what people would consider to be called Bigfoot at that time at 18 years old. I'd never heard anybody talking about it in detail. Here I am standing in front of something that my mind is going through this check down. I'm not looking at it trying to figure out what it is. I'm going through the check down of what it is. I'm looking at saying this isn't a moose, this isn't a black bear, this isn't a brown bear. This does not appear to be a human being. It's just simply too massive. I've seen before that one time I had seen the mount of a 10-foot tall grizzly bear that was killed uh, in Alaska. And I seen this mount of it laying down. And when I looked at 10-foot tall, the body mass, this thing weighed 1,240 some pounds. And I'm looking at how big and how massive this thing is. That was really the only thing I knew at that time how big that mountain had been and how much that live weight of that bear was. So when I was looking at this thing in reference, I'm looking at when I looked upward and I'm scanning, I see its skin. When I looked at its eyes, it took about a half a second of looking at that thing's eyes, and I was off of my feet. I mean, this birch branch or log that it was cradling in its hands, it did not raise it up to throw it at me. It's like it just shucked it. The only thing I could really compare it to is like if you were holding the basketball, Randy, and I was 10 feet away and you just, from your waist, you just passed it to me. There's no winding it up and throwing it. It's just like flicking it right off your fingertips. It did that with this bursting downward at me and it hit me in the waist and took me off of my feet. I mean, I was falling backwards down this incline. I think I probably moved close to 20, if not a little over 20 feet without hitting the ground because I'm falling backwards with the force that this thing hit me at the waist with. And when I hit the ground, it's like a mudslide. I mean, I'm sliding backwards on my back downward. And as I look up at this, I can see this thing. I could feel it too as I'm moving down this hill on my back. The reverberation of it stomping twice on the ground. It never audibly made a sound that I can recall, but twice it stomped on the ground. I could feel that through my back on the ground as I'm sliding down. Just the reverberation, like the vibration of it. And I'm sliding all the way, I slid all the way down, almost probably, I suppose it was 30 yards. I was up this thing down to the edge of the beach. And I try to get to my feet. This birch log that was shucked at me was still laying over my chest, and one of my legs was curled over it as I was sliding down. And I had sprained my one of my ankles pretty good when that happened, when I was sliding backwards. I got to my feet on the beach, and my two friends are sitting there looking at me with their eyes like pies. I mean, they're like, because they see that I'm coming undone. And I don't want to swear on your show, but I mean, I'm yelling at them, get the F in the boat as loud as I could. You just screaming, get in the boat, get in the boat. And they both took off running. Now my friend got the front of the boat pushed off of the beach, and he was standing in the water like knee deep holding the front of this boat. His little brother had jumped over the starboard side of the boat, got in the boat, went back to the motor, and started trying to pull start it and get this thing going. He had put the motor down and was pulling it. I was standing at the edge of where this tree line is, and when I look at where the boat is, like I said, I probably got 35, 40 yards I've got to get across to get to where the boat is. And I wanted to just take off running, but I'm kind of sidestepping it because I can't get my eyes off of this game trail. It feels like this thing's right here, like was behind me. And as I'm kind of sidestepping and limping towards the boat, but doing it in a, hurried, frantic pace, my friend's just yelling at me, come on, come on, come on. And as I'm getting to the boat and getting in it, my friend's yelling, was it a bear? Was it a bear? Was it a bear? He thought that I had been attacked by a bear. And I just, I'm wanting to tell him no, but then I'm thinking, I'm still confused in my head. What the heck has just happened here? Right. I was kind of in shock. I certainly didn't have the time to sit down and have some dialogue discussion with him about what I thought it was at that point. I just jump in the boat. I pull myself up over that starboard edge of the boat and sit on the middle seat. And I'm staring at that tree line. And my friend's little brother is back there pulling. He's probably pulled that motor about 20 times and it hasn't started. And I'm yelling at my friend, you need to get back there. You need to get back there. So he jumps in the boat, and his little brother crosses the middle seat where I am and goes up and sits in the very front seat. And my friend gets in and starts pulling that motor. Now, in retrospect, Randy, I started a boat motor so many times that I would have had that motor running, and so would have my friend. I don't know if his 14-year-old brother has ever started a motor before. I don't know how much experience he had with that. But if you've had any experience with it, little 25 horse boat motor running premix, when you're out there and you've been running it, and if you were to pull that choke on to try to start it, you're going to flood that thing. You don't need to choke it to get that started after it's been running for hours. So I'm thinking he might have flooded it out just immediately when I think back at this, right? Now all of a sudden you've got to turn the choke off, open the gas all the way up, and just keep pulling until you burn that out and get that thing to where it'll start sputtering. But as my friend's pulling this, trying to get it started, I see movement way up the beach to our left, which is the opposite direction where this game trail was, where I see a black bear come flying out of that wood line out onto the beach, stops, looks at us, and starts. I'm not going to say running, but like almost like a gallop, like a really fast pace towards us. And I'm looking at this thing going, what the hell's going on here? This isn't a full grown bear. This is like a 2-year-old bear. It's probably 280, 300 pounds, somewhere in there. It wasn't a big, big bear. But it was missing one of its front paws, like it had been caught in a trap when it was young. Sometimes those bear cubs will get attacked by boars when they're small and get injured like that too. Boars try to kill cubs a lot of times when that next breeding season comes around. They want those cubs out of there so they can have the mom to themselves. So they'll kill cubs. And a lot of times you'll see them with injuries like that. This thing's running towards us, missing a front paw. And I'm yelling at my friend, you've got to get this boat started. You got to get the boat started. I really wasn't afraid of the bear. I kept looking back the other direction at where the game trail was, but I'm thinking something scared this bear out of this wood line. This was not natural for this bear to come not only out to the beach, but then come towards us. Like it found comfort in being close to us rather than human shit. I got to get away from these guys, right? Now it's coming towards us. And I tell my friend's little brother, grab the stringer, grab the stringer. There was a stringer that we had put some walleye and a couple walleye and some northern pike on that was hanging over the edge of the boat. And he grabbed the stringer and pulled a small little, 3-pound northern pike off of it. And as this bear's getting fairly close to us, he throws it up on the shore, thinking this bear's going to grab this fish and eat it. We're only about the front of the boat is probably 15 feet from the edge of the sand water line. And we're like in a foot and a half of water. I mean, we're not floating anywhere. This top of that water is glass because there was no wind. And we're just sitting still. And we watched this bear come up, pick this northern pike up. It bites the head off in one shot and starts chewing it while it's holding the back of the fish in its claws and steadying the other side of it with like its stub where its wrist is. And as it's eating it, it's staring at us. And all of a sudden it stops and looks backwards at that tree line and it drops that fish and takes off running the direction it came from as fast as you've ever seen a bear run. Like it was getting the hell out of there. And that's when I realized whatever this was on this trail is still here. And I'm yelling at my friend, get this thing started. He gets the boat started finally. And his little brother is kind of coming undone a little bit. I mean, he's crying, and he's panicking. This is a lot going on here in like a 3-minute period. They both think that I was attacked by a bear on this trail. Now this bear walks up, a bear walks up the beach to where our boat is, and something scares this thing away, and we're thinking, I'm really having a problem because I know that what I was standing in front of wasn't a bear. I know for a fact this wasn't a bear. This thing, I was guesstimating in my mind, is over 9 foot tall. My friend gets the boat started and we start trolling back trolling away from the shoreline. And I felt like I could breathe now all of a sudden. Like we're finally getting the distance to the shoreline that whatever this thing was, it's not going to be able to get in front of us right now. But my friend's little brother is still kind of coming undone. And I think about this in retrospect. I have two boys right now that are 19 years old. And the young men they were at 13 and 14 and where they are now is two different things. Right now, I could take them into a firefight and they would keep their composure. But at 14, you could break them very easily in a stressful situation. It just is a lot of difference between 13, 14 years old and 18. And so when I think about how this was affecting me and my friend and how it was affecting his little brother, it was a lot different for him, I'm sure. As we're backing up, we get about 60, 70 yards from the shoreline, and I see this thing walk right out of on the off of that game trail out onto this beach. And my friend who's at the motor is staring at this, and he's holy, what, just going off like, you've got to be kidding me. And his little brother in the front is sitting with his back to this because he's in that front little seat where he's facing me. But he hears his brother, who I'm sure he looks up to and is, his safety zone, right? Starting to come undone. And when he looks around and sees it, he starts screaming. I mean, wailing, screaming. Like, what is this? And we watch this walk right out to that water's edge where that fish is laying and very fluidly just crouches down on one leg, grabs that fish with one hand, stands up, and holds it out in front of its body, straight up and down, just staring at our boat. And that's when I got an opportunity to really gauge the size of this, even though now I'm, like I say, 70, 80 yards away from it, not 15 yards. But I can see it standing straight up right now, level with me, standing on that beach. And I realize this thing's as tall as a basketball hoop. Like if I ran full blast and jumped up as high as I could, I don't think I could touch the top of its head. I realized how tall this was. And the body mass from shoulder to shoulder, the width of it. There was so many human elements to its movement and its stride, but it also felt like this is an alien compared to a human because of the mass. There's just nothing that you could coordinate with a human being looking at this mass. And the one thing I have to try to remember now when I look back and remember this is, can you imagine if you were an Aborigine or something in Africa and somebody stood in front of you for the first time, you saw Shaquille O'Neal? All your people are like 4.5 foot, 5 foot tall at the tallest. And here you're standing in front of somebody who's 7.5 foot tall and weighs 4 times as much as you. That Aborigine probably wouldn't feel like he's looking at a human being, right? It's just so different to them. So when I say that didn't look human, to this day I've never seen a human. I've seen these 7.5 foot tall NBA players. I've never seen anything like this, especially with this body mass. The only thing I can compare it to is the grizzly bears that they will hunt out in Alaska that are pushing that record book size of 10 foot that weigh about 1,200 pounds. This thing had to have been over 1,000 pounds. And it had to have been 9.5 to 10 foot tall. Easily. As we backed that boat out of there, we watched this thing for over a minute before it turned around and walked right back into that tree line. And we kept trolling backwards, and my friend kept saying, What was that? What was that? What was that? I don't know what to tell him. I honestly don't even know what words to use to try to explain what I just felt that I was looking at. I had no descriptives. We get the boat back far enough that he puts it in gear and starts, faster than a troll. We started leveling out and get like, let's just get out of here right now, right? And we went about a mile in that boat, and his brother is still wailing away. And I'm putting my hand on his leg, like, it's going to be okay. It's going to be all right. I don't know what I'm trying to calm him down from because I don't know what this thing was. But I just knew that where he was at right now, it was driving me insane hearing him respond like that. I know that sounds insensitive, but it was really hard to listen to. But two, I felt sympathetic for him. Even though I had no understanding what it was, I felt like he's broken. Like he's coming undone, crying, broken. And we went about a mile, and Paul just stopped and turned the motor off. And we both felt like we can't go back to camp right now. We're sitting here having a discussion now about what we thought this was. And we sat there for about almost a half an hour talking about this. And we finally got his little brother to settle down enough to where he still was hyperventilating. He couldn't collect his thought process well, but I mean, he wasn't audibly like shrieking. But I said to my friend, I said, that thing had to have been 10 foot tall. And he said, I would agree. I said, I don't think I can't touch the rim on a basketball hoop. I'm 5'10", and even at 18 years old, I couldn't touch the rim. I said, if I ran as fast as I could and jumped up, tried to touch the top of its head, I don't think I could reach it. He says, yeah, I think you're right. It's had to have been 10 foot tall. I said, when that thing was standing in front of me I went back and told them the whole deal about how that thing broke something to the left of me. When I turned around to the beach, I didn't hear them coming up the trail. I turned around and looked up the trail. Here, this thing standing in front of me. I'm looking right at its size. I explained the descriptives of everything that I've seen with this, and they're my buddy's just like fascinated, like just can't doesn't even know how to respond to this. And I think he would have swore to God that I was making this up had he not seen it walk out on the beach himself. I mean, you hear somebody describe this, how do you put in, even if it's your best friend, you'd think you're being pranked somehow or something.
Can I throw this question out at you?
Yeah.
When when you were up in that trail, in that 4 foot wide game trail, and you were trying to observe any movement to find out where that noise came from, and then your friends were yelling, "What was that noise?" And you looked down the trail, and then when you look back up, there he was. Do you think that he thought, since you had spent such an enormous amount of time there scanning the wood line where he clearly was hiding, that the moment you finally turned, that you were indeed going to be heading down the trail? So he hopped out expecting you to be retreating.
I think that one of the things that I've uncovered in my research since this, and understand, I went decades without researching anything. I mean, I tried so hard to just move from this. Understanding I went into the army, they're going to kick me out of the army if I start telling them I saw it. I won't have a security clearance anymore. You know, I was afraid to tell anybody about what happened to me. Went to college, never found anybody I felt comfortable talking to about there. I went almost 2 decades without really trying to answer these questions of what happened that day. What was I looking at? But when I look at it back in retrospect right now, I believe that um I believe that that there it is a flesh and blood creature I'm looking at. I don't believe there's a supernatural aspect to it. I'm not going to say that I certainly wouldn't follow the data there if my data showed me that, but I just don't see that. I believe it's flesh and blood. I believe that it had to, like you say, it had to have physically moved from point A to point B onto that trail without me hearing it. I also understand how senses can be overwhelmed when you're visually having this experience. When I say I never heard it say make an audible sound, that's not to say that it didn't. I may have been so visually stimulatingly overwhelmed that it could have grunted and I wouldn't even have heard it, right? I believe that it's using an escalated response tiered style system. In order for it to remain elusive and unfound, which it would have to do to survive, it when it encounters a human, it wants one thing: for you to leave. And in most cases, it's capable of withdrawing back into the wilderness before you even knew it was there. And I believe that happens 99 out of 100 times.
Thank you.
This,
But
this,
I want to, I'm sorry to interject in a way that seems like I'm interrupting,
no,
but
go ahead.
I want to thank you for acknowledging, because not enough people are honest enough to acknowledge that when you're taking something in that is really is traumatic, that your observations can be skewered, your your remembering exactly how things happen can be skewered. I feel like because I had fire department training, which got me prepared for what I had, I was able to take in more details. You, on the other hand, you had hunting training with big
Yeah,
game, bear, all of these predators and things like that. So it very similar allowed you to take in more details, but you're still acknowledging that there is an extreme possibility of something happening that you may not have registered with you because all of your other senses were so overwhelmed.
yeah. That and we're only capable of understanding that in which we have a threshold of reference, if that makes sense. When I first went into the Army, where I was stationed, I ran a firing range where I worked with the 1st and the 2nd of the 75th Ranger Battalion. And these guys that were in the Ranger Battalion, when you watched a guy who'd been in that unit 1 year, how he moves through the woods, how he can be elusive and hide, and then you watch a guy who's been doing it for 13 or 14 years, two different levels. The way that the guy who's been doing it for 13 or 14 years, the fluidity of his movement and your inability to reference his silhouette in that wood line and how he moves and how quiet it is. It's like, I can't step without breaking a twig. I don't hear him move from A to B. How is he doing this, right? I can't wrap my head around it. You know why I can't? Because for 14 years, he's lived and breathed that. That's what he's done every day. And he's reached the ability to do it to where I can't comprehend how he does. And I think that applies here. When you have a bipedal raising young ones or a family clan surviving, they don't go to karate practice, they don't go to a soccer game with their kids. All they do: eat, sleep, and survive. And all they do all day long is teach those survival mechanisms to their young. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year for decades, they're in that environment. I think its ability to move that 40 yards or whatever it moved and got on that trail without making any noise, and I believe that there's nothing supernatural about it. I believe that it's just so dang good at it that I can't comprehend that. That it doesn't make sense to me how it can do it.
Well,
But
can
it
I can I
practices it hour after hour its whole life.
I'm gonna throw this out at you, and maybe it's interesting, maybe it's not. You are imagining that from the wood line that's the distance that it covered when you looked back and all of a sudden he was there. So far, the experiences that we've had out at the 400, they strategically, now you are correct. More than likely, it was a lone father family figure male out on that island just to procure food.
Yeah,
But what if there was another one there? So often at the
could
400,
be.
it seems like they move in concerted effort to constantly keep themselves piggybacking and leapfrogging in positions to where one can offer a diversion. So is there a possibility that maybe that big one was somewhere else and the
It
noise you
could be. It could be, just so that people understand. One of the theories that I really research right now is the use of islands like this. Okay. And I don't think it's because they're avid swimmers, so to speak. But I'm going to tell you this: if you're 9 or 10 foot tall and you weigh 1,000 pounds or more, catching a deer isn't easy. I don't care how fast you are, I don't care how strong you are. It's not easy. You're talking about an ambush point. You've got to be able to get an ambush. You aren't going to just chase them down. Okay. And the scent and the smell that these things have, and how leery deer are about smelling certain things and how easily they're set off about stuff, it's just not easy, right? But you put yourself on a small island that has undulation so that when you're in the center of the small island, you've got a viewpoint 360 degrees around the island. Like when I see a deer swimming or something swimming to this island, I see it from a ways away and I know it's coming right here. And I might have to sit on that island 2 or 3 days before something swims to it, but something's gonna swim to it. We've seen enough stuff swimming up there every day
and it'll be
to know
tired when it gets there.
when it comes out of that water onto that shoreline, it is exhausted. You can step out of that tree line, cover that 25 feet, and kill it with no resistance. There's no forest for it to run into. It is effortless to kill that animal at that point. And I just think that that these islands, they could use them as ambush hunting spots because it's just easier that way, right?
And the
Now,
fact
that
and the fact that you said that the game trail was bigger than any game trail you've ever seen. So
yeah.
that means it had already been established for who knows how long.
Well, you got to understand, game trails are made by contact with the ground. It's not the width of the animal. Elk moving through tall grass, 100 of them following each other in a line, that grass still comes back together. But where those hooves were on the ground establishes the width of that trail. So when you start looking at the size of these feet moving up and down it, if you're talking bears, or in this case, a Bigfoot, you could establish, if you're using it often, a pretty wide trail pretty quickly versus deer walking up and down it. They're never going to make a 4 foot wide game trail. They simply, their hoofs, they aren't going to do it. The other thing I consider here is that this isn't something that they just instinctively grew up and say, I know how to hunt on an island myself. It could be that this thing was there with a younger male passing that skill set on. And therefore, one of them broke the branch, and it was the larger one who chose to show itself on the trail. Maybe they were holding two different points of location rather than one moving A to B. I don't know that. Only one had stepped out on the beach, not two. So that's what kind of leads me to believe there was one. But I could see where there could be two. It wouldn't be hard to draw a plausible theory of that of why there would be. It could happen, right? Um, the other thing is I talked about an escalated response system before. When they want you to leave an area, it doesn't have the opportunity on this island to withdraw into the wilderness. There's three human beings that showed up on the beach, and two of them decided to take a piss on your beach. I'm a little offended at that point if I'm this thing. And I don't see a lot of humans. You can sit there for 2 weeks and not see another boat on that lake. That's how rare something of human activity is in that area. But here it's seeing this on this beach, sees me coming up that trail. It can't just withdraw back into the wilderness. It's a 25-acre island. It's stuck there, right? It can't retreat. So I believe there was an escalated system that I was either oblivious to or simply ignorantly ignoring. Meaning, it may have started with a whistle, it may have started with a knock or a clack. It's trying to do something to make you feel uncomfortable and say, ooh, I need to leave, right? I still didn't. I'm walking up this trail. Now all of a sudden, a giant branch cracks and breaks. What happens? I stand there staring at the woods for 2 minutes. I'm still not leaving. Perhaps it's reached that point at that point saying, I have to show myself. I don't need to kill it. If it wanted to kill me or hurt me, it could have hit me with that branch in 1 second before, and it would have killed me before I even knew it was there. It obviously wasn't out to attack me. It was there trying to get us to leave. And I believe there were certain signs that probably took place in its attempt to do that that I was unaware of, that it simply reached the choice where when I didn't leave when that big branch got broken, most people would say, geez, I don't know what the hell I did that, but I'm getting out of here, right? I didn't. I didn't. And that's not a normal response. I don't think it felt that would be normal. I think it expected that I would leave when it broke that branch. Like this is going to make him unsettled, right? And I don't. Now all of a sudden it reaches kind of that desperate measure of I need to show myself. And it steps out and I turn around and look at it. And for about 3.5 seconds, I'm standing there staring at this thing, trying in my mind analyze what it is. I don't just look at it and immediately scream and run away. I'm kind of in shock here. And now it's thinking, showing myself, it still is standing here. I need to shuck this when I'm holding at it. It just kept stepping it up until what happened? We left. That's what it wanted.
So
And
you
it was
guys stop.
going to,
So you guys stop in the boat and have a 30-minute conversation to bring it back down to something that you guys can understand. So take us back to that point,
well,
because I'm interested in knowing how you guys entered camp with that information.
so Paul, my friend is desperately trying to understand something that I'm not capable of explaining to him because once he's seen it on the beach, he basically has the same data that I have. I mean, he wasn't as close to it as I was, but as far as what it looked like and the descriptives and the mass and the height and all that, he's got the same data I do at that point, and both of us are still looking at each other like this makes no sense. His little brother, we really didn't involve in the conversation that much because we felt like we were both just happy that he wasn't coming undone at that moment. Just keep de-escalating him rather than involving him in the what do you think it was, right? Um, Plus he was incapable of having that conversation. My friend said we can't we're going to go back to the deal, but I'm not going to tell my dad about this. That didn't make sense to me. My dad was a hunting guide. I would want to tell him about it. But my friend was saying, you don't understand. We've been here 4 days and we have 4 or 5 more, and we're going to be the butt of everybody's joke. Nobody's going to believe what happened to us. No, but when we describe what happened here and what we looked at, nobody's going to believe this. They're going to make fun of us. We're going to be a laughing joke to these people. And he says, even if my dad believed me, he says, I don't know if he'd really believe me. He might say that he does. I don't know that he would, but I know all my uncles and my cousins are going to ridicule us. He says, I don't want to tell them. And I looked at him and I said, I don't know if that's the right answer, but this isn't my dad, it's your dad. So, I'll let you decide. If that's what you want, I'll honor that. And so we went back to the camp, and it's a different climate for us. I mean, when you saw us coming to the dock, we were standing up in the boat and hollering and waving and peacocking around and whatnot. We pulled up to that boat. Nobody said a word. Everybody was standing on the dock. We were the last boat to get there. And when we got out of the boat, um, everybody was like, "How's it going?" And we were like, "Good, good." Just one word answers. I think it kind of felt like, "What's going on with these guys?" Right? I think that aura was there in the group, but I mean, we weren't like crying or screaming or freaking out. Nobody was bleeding really, and so nobody just really pursued asking about it. And as everybody kind of went off the dock, they had lunch going over there. They went over there to eat, and I just stood out on the dock staring towards Patton Island, thinking to myself, how am I going to make this make sense, to me? This is not supposed to exist out here. And the literally hundreds of hours that I've spent in the most remote areas hunting big game, dangerous game sometimes, I just couldn't wrap my head around what had just happened that day. And the oldest of these three Inuit guides, the oldest brother, walked out onto that dock and walked up to me and said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Did you get in an argument with your friends?" I think in his head that would explain why we were being quiet, right? Like maybe we were fighting. And I looked at him, I said, "No." And he goes, "Well, what's wrong?" And I told him, I said, "We just experienced something out there that doesn't really make sense to me. I'm just trying to wrap my head around this." And he says, "In the boat or were you on land?" And I said, "We were on Patton." I told him we were on Patton Island because I didn't know the name of the little island that we were on that was northwest of Patton Island. There wasn't a name on the map. But if I said Patton Island, at least he'd know what area we were, right? So I said we were on Patton Island. And he looked at me and said, "I want to show you something." And I said, "Okay." And he walked me off of that dock and we walked into the woods about probably 150 feet down the shoreline in the woods. They had a boathouse, like a little wooden cedar sided boathouse. This thing looked like it was 100 years old. I mean, it was falling apart, dilapidated. There was old, crappy outboard motors just hanging in there that hadn't ran in decades, right? And laying beside it, upside down, was a V-hulled aluminum boat with a tarp over it. And he took the bricks off, or the rocks off the corner of the tarp and pulled the tarp over. And he got on the other side of the boat and he flipped the boat upright. And I'm looking at it, and the port side of that boat is completely caved in, like V'd in. If you can imagine, if you set a boat without a trailer, just upright in the middle of a highway and T-boned it with a motorcycle doing about a 50 mile an hour, and you caved that in like that, that's what this looked like. Like it's not seaworthy, and something catastrophic caved this thing in and V'd it in on that side. And I said, "What happened?" And he says, "I'm going to share something with you, but it's probably best that this stays with me and you." And I said, "Okay." And he goes, "Last fall, I was guiding a moose hunter, and my brothers each were guiding hunters in their boats on the other end of Granville Lake, but I was up in that area by Patton Island, and we had seen a nice moose on a shoreline of one of these islands, and we pulled up on the opposite, not the opposite side of the island, but several hundred yards wrapped up the shoreline. They had pulled up and came back down that shoreline and shot that moose. And they went over to it. The client had his rifle there, and they took pictures of him with it, and it was all smiles and everybody's happy. And he said, I loaded him back in the boat, and instead of taping this moose out, he was going to run him back to the camp because he was pretty sure that his brothers were done that hunting that day and were coming back to camp too. And then he would come back with one of his brothers and quarter this moose and load it up. But he said he really wasn't worried about dressing it out and loading it up. It's right on the beach. I mean, he can pull his boat. Not like he has to pack this thing out a long ways. So when he dropped this client back off at the camp and came back out there to the island, he said he pulled up. His brothers still weren't answering their they had little two-way radios or something, and they weren't answering them. Of course, back in 1987, 86, those weren't an exact science either. I mean, but he couldn't reach them at first. And so he skinned this moose and quartered it and grabbed one of the front quarters and threw it over his shoulder and walked over to the boat, threw it in the boat, and all of a sudden started hearing this screaming. And he says, "You've never heard this sound in your life, this screaming coming from that tree line." And said that he was in the boat and he looked up, and this thing's on two legs walking out of that tree line at him, like jogging at him, just screaming. And he said, I jumped out of the other opposite side of the boat, and this thing ran up, put its hands on the sides of the gunwale of the boat, and threw its knee into this boat and dented it in, and kept doing that. Boom, boom, like 6, 7 times till the side of that boat was just caved in. And he said, I was freaking out. I'm trying, I grabbed my gun, and he said he had his gun unloaded. He grabbed his gun, couldn't, he was trying to get it loaded. This thing ran back into the tree line and is inside of that tree line, and it's now getting twilight dark. It's starting to get dark. And he gets on his radio again and starts calling for his brothers, and he finally gets them to answer. And he said, I need you to hurry up, get here. I need you to get here. And he said, I started thinking, these guys aren't going to believe what's happened to me. They've lived up there their whole lives, and they've never experienced anything with one of these. Never. There was no folklore in their family. They hadn't been exposed to, like what you hear now. It's like, oh, for generations, we've heard about this. That wasn't the case with them. They came from a line that lived and breathed year round in that stuff, and they'd never had an experience with it before. At least these three hadn't. And he didn't feel comfortable like this. His brothers would believe him. He told me, he said, I was reluctant to tell him. And he sat there listening to this thing for about 5 minutes, making noise in that tree line. It was still there. And he finally got his gun loaded and kept looking at the tree line. He said, I couldn't see anything. He was like laying there in prone position next to that boat, waiting to shoot at that tree line, and nothing came out. Finally, he could hear the boats after about 15 minutes. He could hear one of the boats of his brothers coming towards him. And he stood up and realized this thing's left. It's not making any noise. It hadn't been now for a few minutes. And he yelled at the tree line. Nothing yelled back. He said it just seemed to be gone. And when his brother showed up, he told his brothers, they both were in the same boat. He told them that they had shot this moose and that a cow moose came out and was ramming his boat when he was doing this. Now, just so you understand, that would not be uncommon. These cow moose, when they give birth to an animal, for 3 years, they will stay with their young. For 3 years. You can get a bull moose that's not huge, but not bad either. And he's still got a protective mother that weighs 1,800 pounds that will trample you if you get close to them. I mean, they're just so scary protective. And so the idea that one of these could have came out and rammed his boat wasn't, and that's not that hard to believe if you were in that, grew up in that atmosphere and understood how these animals are. And that's what he told his brothers. What I didn't tell you here is when this thing was kneeing the side of the boat, it grabbed that front quarter that he had put in that boat and threw it over his shoulder and took that with it back into the trees, he said. So when his brothers show up, he's telling them that it was a cow moose that rammed his boat. They start packing this moose out and throwing it in their boat. And they got 3/4 and the back straps and the hide and the head. And they're like, where's the other quarter? And he's like, what? What? And they're like, we only have 3/4 here. Where's the other quarter? And he realized he didn't have any choice now but to tell them what happened. And so he did. He told them every detail of what happened. And he said, Jeff, he says, I'm going to tell you something. Your best bet is your best route right now is whatever happened to you out there, try to get yourself to a place where you were before it happened and exist there. Because nothing good will ever come of telling anybody about this. If something happened to you, similar to me, nothing good will ever come of telling anybody. They won't get it. And I said, what do you mean? And he says, one of my brothers to this day believes me, and the other one thinks I made it up and I'm a liar. And you're talking about three brothers who each other is all they got. They depend so fiercely on each other when they survive out in this wilderness. To have one of them say they don't believe you would just be gutting you. And he says, I wish I never would have told him. But right away he said, did something like this happen? And I said, it didn't attack me like that, but it was in front of me and it threw a log at me. And he said, you're bleeding. And I had a white sweatshirt on that said lifeguard in red letters. And I lifted it up and you could see just on the edge of the bottom edge of my sweatshirt by my hip, there was a little bit of blood on it because when this log hit me in my midsection, it scraped me there. And I lifted my shirt up and showed him, and there was a scrape about the size of my hand going up my hip into my stomach area. And he went back to his backpack and came back and gave me a bunch of gauze compresses and some tape and said, this should be enough for a couple of days. He says, but don't tell anybody about this and tell your friends not to tell anybody about this. I said, my friend already had made asked me to swear not to tell anybody, but he doesn't want to tell his dad because he doesn't think anybody will believe him. And he looked at me and said, he's right.
Wow.
But just to see that boat and the damage that it had done to that boat made me realize what this thing could have been capable of. But these were two different situations. When I look back on this now, I realize that that guide and his client went and killed that moose on this shoreline. And that's like stealing out of this thing's cupboard. That moose belongs to him, not to you. And
Well,
you
especially
came to
given
his shoreline and killed it.
so was it on the backside of Patterson Island?
No, no. So that's the other interesting thing is when he said this happened on Patton Island, he said to me, and I said, no. Or I asked him, I said, where did that happen with the boat and your client? He says, it wasn't on Patton Island. It was the small island to the northwest of it, which was the island we were on, but I didn't know the name of it. And I
Okay,
told him Patton Island because at least he'd know where we were, right?
right.
That's
Yeah.
why I referred to it as Patton Island. When he said it wasn't Patton Island, where this happened to him was the little island to the northwest of Patton Island. That's the one we were on.
Well,
So
I'm looking at your map right now, and you can see that there's a little peninsula on Patton Island that's
yeah,
that's very close to that northwest island. So it would seem to me like that would be a great strategy for any deer coming in on that big island to cross to that smaller island to already be set up to you know to capture one that comes in there. But also you don't know, it could have been on the end of a 3 day stretch of a dry run where it was on the third day of waiting for a moose or a deer when that gentleman and his client came in
yeah,
and shot the only moose that had shown up in a week. So I can understand the
sure.
frustration of a Bigfoot possibly.
Yeah, when we showed up, we just had to take a leak, right? I mean, we weren't there trying to steal its resources, so to speak, you know. And quite honestly, we did the opposite. I didn't realize we were doing it, but when we threw that fish out there, I think the reason why it stepped out of that wood line was to go get that, pick it up, and accept it. Like this is your sorry for being here. Like I'm not saying that there's some, you know, intimate message to be put out there or
There
whatever,
might be.
intricate,
There might be.
but you don't know that. I look at I've had 30 some years in retrospect to look back at this and try to make sense at why did it do this? Why was it on the island? I think I understand now the hunting reasons why it would have been on that island. Why did it respond the way that it did? I think it used an escalated response system. I think it wanted us to leave. It needed us to leave, and it didn't have the option of withdrawing into the wilderness and saying, they won't even know that I'm here, right? No, he's thinking if these three guys lined up and walked from one end of the island to the other, they're going to find me and I can't hide. I need them off of this island.
Yes. Yes.
So,
And that bring
it really was in a I don't have a choice position to finally show itself when we kept heeding maybe all these possible get out of here type setups that occurred before that.
I've got two questions I want to throw at you about that bear that you saw on the beach.
Hmm.
And that is, you said that it was missing a paw. Could you tell if it was an old wound or a fresh
It
wound?
was an old wound.
Okay.
I believe that And it looked clean when it got close, and it looked like it looks like it may have been in a trap.
Okay. Well,
It may have gotten caught in maybe not a proper bear trap, might have been caught in a predator trap like a wolf trap or a snare.
yeah.
And that
Well, the
happened.
second part of the question would be, do you think that that would cause the bear having trouble swimming?
I don't think so. Um, and the only reason why I say that is it seems to have adapted pretty well. I mean, when it was running down the beach, it's using that's one of its four wheels in running mode, and it didn't slow that bear down a hair. So I think it was an old enough wound that it had adapted and moved past it. Also, when you're if a wound like that happens to a 5 or 6 year old bear, they might not recover well from it. Happening to a year-old bear, and now he's two, might not have been that hard at all for that bear to move past that wound and adapt to it. I don't know, but
Well, I mean, I don't know if you need to or want to go into any details after the fact of where we're at this point, but I would like to throw in there I have been doing nothing but dreaming about going up there and being guided on a couple of week excursion and going from island to island with my thermal drone and being able to look at
see,
those islands.
I do that now in the boundary waters area between Minnesota and Canada. The boundary waters area is 1,400 miles of navigable waterways. It is a grid of connected lakes that does have some outfitters that people will go and canoe into the boundary waters, but there's one or two, three main paths people will go to get way off grid 50 miles into the boundary waters. You could be up there for 2 weeks and not see anybody else. I mean, there's some very remote areas, but lots of islands. And to me, that is really interesting that when you have these small islands, the first thing I want to do is in the first day or 2 days of kayaking or canoeing those areas, I want to know, am I seeing big game swimming? If I'm seeing them swimming, then I know that any given island you can show up, there might be two or three deer on it, there may be a bear on it, there's going to be animals there if you're seeing them swimming, right? And I really can't come up with a reason. People say, why would they swim from island to island? I've reached the point where I've seen it so much, I can't come up with a plausible explanation why they wouldn't at this point
Right. And
because I've just seen it.
what's enticing to me about that prospect is the defined borders of an island is
Yeah.
so much different than a piece of land that's
If you
surrounded by
go on there at night and you fly a drone over a small 10 to 20 acre island that
you'd
is
find the heat
wooded,
signatures.
you will find, even though it's wooded, you will find those heat signatures of the deer, the marmots, the frickin' fishers, everything that's on that island. And, especially when you're talking something that would weigh over 700, 800 pounds, you aren't going to miss that heat
Well,
signature.
it seems if you pull up on in a boat, say to a beachhead, that whatever is on that island is going to work its way in your direction to determine your degree of whether they need to worry about you or not. So using a drone would be a no brainer.
The one reason why I think they might not use an island to hunt from is if there's enough human boat traffic in those areas that they understand when they're on an island, they're extremely vulnerable. There's boundaries around where they can be elusive and recede into. They can't do that on an island, right? They aren't looking at saying, oh, they might have heat signatures, they might have whatever. They aren't looking at that. They're simply looking at the layout and the escapability of a situation, and that doesn't exist on an island. Now, if I don't see a lot of human traffic there, that's a risk I'll take in order to benefit from the hunting opportunity. But if I see regular boat traffic in that water, I don't care how many islands there are, I might look at that and say, I'm not going to put myself in that position to where I'm taking that risk. You have to, I think it has to be a pretty remote area of islands on a lake or a waterway in order for one to look at that and say, I'm going to use that hunting advantage because the risk is minimal enough where it's not going to. And people think, well, I don't know if they think like that. You can't, if your main goal is to survive and be elusive, and you understand that your main apex is humans when it comes to threatening that, that's exactly how you think.
Well,
That
from
is
what
exactly
I've
how you
seen,
think.
what I've seen already, uh, established patterns of behavior that they will use the same trajectory and pathways or whatever. But for
Mm,
you to describe a 4 foot wide game trail clearly shows that it had an established setup on that island that was successful enough for that to be maintained over a period of time. So that may be the island that we have to get back to with a drone to see what's going on that island.
yeah. When I've looked at this island and I look at all the other islands on this lake and I think, is there a key to where it's placed? Is there a key to, I don't think there are. I don't think it is. When you look at the remoteness of this and you realize there are no roads anywhere there. I mean, we took a trail that was only there because these brothers had established it over time. But this is a place where, and this is something I talk a lot about with people, remote. Your idea of remote is only valid based on your threshold of reference. Okay. Somebody's idea of remote in Florida, in the Florida swamps and stuff, there's probably some remote areas there, but it's not the same as somebody who is in this area where I was up there. There's not another human being within 75 miles of where our group was. Guaranteed. Guaranteed. There wasn't.
Well,
And
before we cull this interview down to the final stages, uh, I've got opportunities in the near future. I don't know how near, that could involve some type of funding for something interesting. Would you be open to combining, if I could get funding to where we could spend a couple of weeks basically doing what you did as an 18-year-old, scouring around through there? Not, I don't want to be fishing and I don't even want to be hunting. I just want to be going, checking out islands to islands, and using the technology that we have now to see if that it wouldn't be fruitful.
yeah,
Would you be
no,
interested?
yeah, I would definitely consider that. I have some of the areas, I my one of my first big research project I did in partnership with Doug Hychek, and he helped me considerably with that. Just because we were both in the areas of northern Minnesota where I was doing it, and I learned an awful lot from him. But when I started looking at his experiences up at the cabin up at the lake that he was in up in Canada, and I start looking at the experiences his son Blaine had at Angleworm Lake and things like that, where he backpacked in almost 20 miles to an area with his girlfriend. These are areas where there's water, there's islands and whatnot, and all of these elements existed in those areas too. And that's what really makes this interesting to me is some of the discussions that I have with people on, if you were Bigfoot, what would your biggest apex threat be other than humans, obviously? And I hear people say, oh, it'd be like grizzly bears and stuff. I really don't think it would be. I think that a grizzly bear understands that if it got in a tangle with one of these, it wouldn't work out well for either. It's just not worth the risk of doing that, right? Stay out of each other's way. I think there's a natural respect that there's no reward worth that risk of fighting to that degree. I think that mountain lions are, they run away from humans 99% of the time. They don't want to be anywhere near a human. Every now and then, we make the mistake of triggering the pursuit instinct that exists in a feline. Take your normal domestic house cat that's laying in the sun taking a nap and put a feather on a string and drag it by it. This thing comes like, holy smokes, I've got to get this thing, right? That exists in felines, and sometimes mountain bikers and hikers and joggers, we trigger that in mountain lions. Most of the time, mountain lions don't have nothing to do with a human. I think that would be the same with Sasquatch. I don't think they'd want anything to do with it. I think the biggest apex threat is because of the multiplicity of the threat is a pack of wolves. You get 8 or 10 wolves in a pack. I don't care if you're 1,200 pounds. I don't care if you're 10 foot tall. You're in trouble. You are in trouble. You can't outrun that pursuit. You can That pursuit will drag you down over time. I've seen videos of groups of 10, 12 wolves killing mature adult grizzly bears because they can't withstand that type of attack over time. They succumb to it. I think that's the biggest threat. And I can tell you where I never see a pack of wolves is on an island, ever. Not on these small islands. They just don't swim to them. So if you want to kill something and eat it over a couple days or bring it back to your family clan, but kill it and do it in a way that's not disturbed. I'm not attracting a pack of wolves. As an archer, I shoot a deer archery hunting. If I leave that thing sit overnight, I've got a pack of coyotes on it. Overnight, almost every single time if I don't get that deer retrieved. I think that that's the same with Sasquatch. They kill something, they're either going to consume it or they're going to get it out of that area. There is no leaving it in a space to where it attracts these wolves and coyote packs, because that to me is its biggest threat. It would not want to be up against that in any situation. And that's why I think that's just another thing about these small islands using them to hunt from. You don't really have that threat on these islands. But
Yeah. So what do you think would be the bigger obstacle? Getting a kill off an island to your family or bringing your family to the island?
um I think they'd get the kill off the island. And this is why. The one thing I thought was really interesting, and people, I didn't realize this until I'd been asked this so many times, is did you smell anything? When it was in front of you, did you smell anything? I didn't. But then again, it had just swam to this island for hours, probably in the water. Maybe I wouldn't smell it. Maybe because of that, I didn't smell anything. It had been raining for almost 2 or 3 days, you know? I just didn't smell anything. But if I'm going to take a dead deer that I've killed and I'm going to swim that back to the mainland over an hour in the water, guess what? I don't have on that deer anymore either. Scent. Probably not going to attract coyotes and wolves like it would if I just killed it and threw it over my back and started walking with it. So maybe it's accomplishing something both ways there. It's making itself hard to distinguish because it's just swam, but also any game that it removes from that island, swimming it back to a mainland shoreline, whatever it's hauling back doesn't really stink anymore either,
Yeah.
or at least
Well,
not to the degree it would have.
well, one of the things that I keep falling back on in my thought process is how established that particular trail was going up the incline off the beachhead.
Yeah, yeah,
So for it to be that
that is
established means that
interesting.
it's something that not only has it been set up for a while, it keeps going back to it and using it over and over again.
Yeah. The other thing to consider is, and this is something that I've been in some roundtable discussions on. When you talk about clan size and you talk about when people bring up the topic of demeanor, how a lot of these southern encounters seem to involve more volatility or, just short-tempered type, like they're just mean, right? You hear that often, that's they were very vocal and they very hostile seem. I kind of wonder if you can do that in the South, probably because its biggest threats, alligators, feline, mountain lions, whatever. I don't, you don't have the threat of grizzly bears and wolf packs down south. Okay. Its need to be in a large clan doesn't really exist. I think two or three of them in a group could exist easily down south, right? What you're worried about is poisonous snakes and alligators and things like that. You don't need 10 of you to ward that off, right? But when you start talking about year round, when it's 0 degrees, the caloric intake it would take to get through a day in January or February in Manitoba and the threats that you have in those areas, there may be a need for a 10 individuals in a clan to work together and survive. The roles they play, the hunters, the nurturers, the watchers, the overwatchers, they all have a role that they would have to play in order to survive as a group. I think the reverence they would hold for each other and the need that they would have for each other to survive in that northern environment is more complex than what it would take for one to survive in Texas or Florida.
Yes.
I think it'd be easy for two of them to get by in Florida. Two of them are dead meat in Manitoba when it comes to wolf pack stuff. Now you get 10 or 12 of them in a family clan up there, you could ward off a wolf pack. You could actually work together. And so the idea that they might work that closely to survive together in a larger clan because of the necessity of it up there might also help where you were going to lead to why would there be more than one on that island? Because they do stuff together. They need to. The threats that they exist amongst cannot be dealt with one or two of you at a time. It takes a group. And I just kind of wonder if, that's the case here. Because it's an interesting point. Why was there such an established game trail on such a small island?
Yeah, in close proximity to Patton Island there, with that little peninsula, as close as it was to that, that would
Yeah,
probably be where a deer would go out to the end of that peninsula and say, "Hey, I can see the
sure.
land right over there," and swim across, and that's where the game trail was.
Yeah. That's the other thing about swimming from point A to point B. You're not going to swim any further than you need to. It's going to be a direct line.
My God, I want to go up there so bad with the thermal drone, and
Yeah.
just the potential is certainly there.
Yeah, I think that it certainly isn't something that you would need a large group of people to accomplish. I
Right.
mean, I've been on research stuff where it's like we need a drone expert or two. We need 3 people, 4 people on the ground who are in shape enough to cover distance, who have the wherewithal to endure that day after day. We need somebody who's really good at the logistics of feeding everybody and keeping a base camp set up. We need a comms guy who's really good at making sure everybody's in communications with each other and is in charge of that process. We need a medical expert in case somebody gets injured. I mean, you look at the components to really go somewhere for 7 or 10 days, takes a lot.
And in these days, we are so more advanced now. We could even have now they've got the portable satellite dishes, the Elon Musk satellites, where you could invest in having that, so you'd have internet connection at base camp. And so
Yeah.
so the technology is there if we can just go ahead and just get the funding and go ahead and pay that and
Well,
spend
and
a
what you're looking at doing is everything from the base of the drone platform, whether it's the dual camera setup, the 4K during the daytime, or are we going to run the thermal at night? Switch back and forth, run them both at the same time. It can do either. You're going to have battery relays, a ton of batteries, so that you can run a 25 to 30-minute flight time, come back, switch it out, and be the next one's back in the air again. But when you see something, the idea is different angles of photographic capture, okay, and video capture. It's not pursuing it. I don't care if it makes any noise. I'm not trying to get it to bang on something. I
right.
don't need it. I am going for photographic and video capture, and that's it. The ability to do that, it's not some 4 or 5 dimensional project. It's one aspect we're trying to accomplish. And
Yeah.
to me, your probability of success is higher when you start trying to accomplish less. Okay. Because so much of what people are out there trying to accomplish doesn't move the ball in proving whether or not this exists for science to understand. Does not do that. If me and you go out and bang on a tree and something bangs back, we got a great story to tell. We haven't proved shit at that point. All
This
in the night and something howls back, great story, proved nothing.
exactly. So yeah, that I'm so over all that stuff.
If you're on a waterway where you could have a motorized boat, which is, that's not the case in the boundary waters, but you go up into these remote areas like we were in up in Manitoba, um, if you can get a boat somehow there and launched, you're good to go. And you really don't need more than a 16-foot aluminum guide series boat with a 40 or 50 horse outboard tiller on it. To me, if you look at where this technology is now, and I'm not talking about a year ago or 2 years ago, I'm talking about right now, the thermal capability and the imagery that's being produced by these drones, these $10,000 to $12,000 setups, I'll tell you what, you will not be wondering what you're looking at flying that drone over one of those islands. All the things that people will use to argue why maybe a drone won't work, which I think are weak arguments to begin with. But when you start dealing with the range of one, or the noise that they give off, or the detectability of hearing one or seeing one, if you're chasing something over a mainland, you're always going to have that problem of them being elusive and being able to withdraw before you even knew they were there, before you even got a drone in their area. There was enough notice for them to do something defensively to remain elusive. When they're on an island, their pants are down. You've caught them in a position that they can't escape the detectability. They just can't. Just that good at detecting when a human gets into an area, they know not to be there. They know not to expose themselves. Those risks are not negotiable anymore to them, and they just don't do it. It's not just me. I have a network of over 100 guides that I have talked to most of them on personal conversations. Have you ever seen anything you couldn't find a natural explanation for when we're out there? No, no, they haven't seen it. And you start looking at the 9,000 hours that I've spent over 20 years looking through a spotting scope, and you start multiplying that by 100 other guides too. I'm telling you what, if they were there in the amount of population that this community would like you to believe they are, that's not possible. This whole Bigfoot on demand, we can go camping this weekend and see them, is ridiculous.
It is.
You put 5 dentists in a field in a remote area camping for 10 days. You know what they report back? Nothing. You put 5 Bigfooters out there, they're making 10 documentaries off of what they experienced out there. But I'm going to tell you, the occurrence rate that this community wants you to believe that they exist at is fiction.
Well, I sure appreciate everything that you've filled us in with tonight. To hear a hunter's point of view, even though you had a spectacular, life-changing event, to understand how rare it is, and just my God, the details are off the charts with what you laid out to us today.
I wrote a book called The Pine Island Incident. I published it with Doug's Hanger One Publishing. You can go to hangar1publishing.com. I wrote a book called The Pine Island Incident, where I not only share that encounter, but I go a little bit more in depth, talk about the actual trip we took up there and what it was like stopping at places. And, you know, it's just one of those things that there's so many details. You can't go on a show for an hour and a half and just share it all. This wasn't an instance where I saw something walk across a road from 450 yards away and 10 seconds later it was gone. This was a little bit of a drawn out encounter with physical contact with more than one person present, and then the relation of the guide sharing his experience. I mean, when you start getting into it, there is a lot that you can glean from this. There's little bits of it that people say, I relate to that. Maybe not the whole thing, but there's parts of it where they say, man, I've heard that. I heard other people say that same thing, you know?
Well, when it comes to at the beginning, I was talking about a component of your story that I was going to talk about of how I had something happen where
Yeah.
even in 2013, I was thermal cameraing from a tree, watching the vehicle that myself and my wife was sleeping in, and I was there because of somebody else reporting multiple Bigfoot happenings in that location. So my wife and I were sleeping in a vehicle there. Well, we did have a visitor that showed up and was throwing rocks at the vehicle, and it woke myself and my wife up at about 3 a.m. We heard a loud bang where a rock hit the vehicle. So, and that's all that happened, just a rock throw. So the couple of days later, watching the thermal video, you could see a rock come flying in from low to the ground at about a trajectory, and you could see the rock glance off the hood of the vehicle.
It's like a softball pitch
Yes,
almost.
well, like a sidearm throw. That's
Yeah, yeah.
it didn't have much of an arc. It was only about 6 foot off the ground, and it glanced off the hood of the vehicle. But what I didn't know is there was a second rock thrown. You see, come from the same direction, where it goes over the top of the vehicle and hits a tree on the far side of the vehicle and drops to the ground. So there was a total of 2 rocks thrown, and they both were white, showing heat.
Hmm.
And one did hit the vehicle, and that's the one that woke us up at 3 a.m. that caused us to look for that in the video itself. But even at that time in 2013, when that happened, I was like, that was very low to the ground. I said it's almost like it was throwing underhanded, or at the very least, throwing sidearm. Uh, but now with your story showing that it threw that birch log with an underhanded position as it chunked it at you,
Hmm.
maybe that's a more natural throwing position, and it would allow them to avoid a lot of branches if it was under the canopy.
The one thing that I think almost anytime you hear of something being thrown, it's being thrown underhanded. And the reason why I say that is one, consider the muscle mass that I was standing in front of. You don't need to throw it overhand to get at a distance. Okay. That type of muscle mass that they have, the ability to just swing something underneath. Now, the other thing is when you start talking about accuracy and mechanics, If me and you stood 15 feet away from a wall and we had quarters, and I said, let's see who can toss a quarter and get it closest to the wall on the floor without hitting it. You're not throwing it overhand. To be that accurate, you're going to toss it underhand because you know you have more control that way. You can get it pinpointed better underhand than overhand. Okay. And when you have that kind of muscle mechanic and that type of build, throwing something underhand, you can throw it 30, 40 yards underhand, no problem. But I believe they have more control.
Well, the only relatable thing that we have as human beings is your female softball pitchers,
Yeah.
underhanded,
Yeah.
extremely accurate in the strike range,
Yeah.
and it seems the dynamics of swinging their arm and throwing it, to me, somebody who doesn't practice that kind of throw is like, man, I would throw it so wild, but they are very accurate that way. So
It's a muscle memory mechanical movement that is identically replicated over and over without flaw when you get that good at it.
we have had some incidents where rocks were being thrown and you can actually hear when the rock hits a branch, and specifically I'm talking about the 400 and in the Kiamichi Mountains where I've had a lot of things happen. So when the rocks are being thrown, there's occasionally where you can hear it hitting branches, and that certainly changes the trajectory of where they're trying to throw it. And that so you would think that they, if they're trying to be accurate, that they would avoid as many hitting as many branches as possible, or if any at all.
It
So
could
that,
just be juveniles that are trying to get good at something.
yeah, so there has to be an element of practice, a youngster practicing at
Sure,
times. But you would think, yes, so they want to avoid hitting branches because you can't get where you're wanting to get with that throw if it's deflected by a branch. So
sure,
using an underhand throw that keeps it under the canopy is certainly seems more reasonable than throwing it up in through the canopy.
sure. No,
Well,
I enjoyed the conversation. It was a good time. I appreciate you having me on.
so please go to the descriptions on this video and click the link to go to Pine Island Research and check out Jeff's stuff. And certainly you might be interested in purchasing his book. It is going to be much more detailed than our discussion here. So you might enjoy having that in your library. Thank you.